opposite of heaven, to the point where, she didn't want to come back. So we're looking at part 3 of our hydrotherapy theory and practice series that we're doing. And just a reminder of our disclaimer that you check everything out clearly, do your own due diligence, and the things that we talk about are just tools in your toolbox, and shouldn't accept anything blindly that comes along, but just to take special care and checking things out for yourself. Back in 1903, a very forward-looking statement was made by Thomas Edison that the doctor of the future will give no medicine, but will instruct his patient in the care of the human frame, in diet, and in the cause and prevention of disease. And he may have been piggybacking on some statements that were made prior to that, even back in 1885. Testimonies for the Church. The statement was made that there's many ways of practicing healing art, but there's only one way that heaven approves. And essentially that boils down to the things that God has provided for us. Pure air and water, the cleanliness, proper diet, purity of life, and a firm trust in God. And it just talks about the fact that it takes some practice to learn the skills that are necessary to be able to use God's natural remedies effectively, in a way that is more effective than the expense for medications, as well as the expense on the system that those things provide. And in 3 John 1 verse 2, it just admonishes us to take care of our soul, in that also helps our health and our prosperity in other areas of our life as well. In Romans 12, 1 and 2, just admonishes us again to not be conformed to the world, but be transformed in the renewing of our minds through Christ Jesus. So tonight, I thought what we would do, as we've been looking at the theory and practice, is go into just a brief history of the practice of hydrotherapy. We know that hydro is water. Therapy is using that water as a treatment basis. And just look at how that was used through ancient times. It's referred to back in 450 BC. That's 450 years before Christ. Hippocrates tells of its use. The practice is theoretically as old as the practice of medicine. So it's been used forever, as long as people have been treating illnesses. It was commonly used in Roman baths in various ways, just not only to soak, but also various shower type practices or pouring. And it fell into obscurity during the Dark Ages, between 476 and 800 years after Christ. Is considered the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. Hippocrates is attributed with the idea of first doing no harm. And while it's not necessarily a direct quote, the idea is one that stands tall as being one that he advocated during his time. John Wesley actually had a profound influence on the use of hydrotherapy back in 1747. He wrote a book called Primitive Physique that was designed to be a way that everyone could access the remedies and treatments that could benefit them. 32 editions were printed throughout the course of its run history. This is a fairly impressive run. He was a founder of the Methodist Church. He was deeply convicted that God is concerned about our earthly life as well as our heavenly one. And so he felt like it was important that those treatments that were readily available to people should be made available to them. So he had water indicated for things like asthma, colds, colic, rickets, headaches, whooping cough, rheumatism, swelling, sciatic, a whole host of different ailments that were benefited by water treatments. According to him, water treatments were an easy and natural way of curing most diseases. Then naturally, within that time period, there were probably other treatments that were not probably as beneficial. So water treatments or hydrotherapy stood out because they actually were functional and worked. So John Wesley was an early advocate of hydrotherapy, which is kind of interesting to note. In 1799 to 1851, Winternitz also advocated for hydrotherapy, and he was also known as the father of hydrotherapy. He actually became aware of hydrotherapy after a farm injury. He was gored by an animal. Physicians held out no hope for him as a result of his injury, but he began treating himself in the same way that he had his animals when they were injured, using hydrotherapy, hot and cold treatments, and various circulation-inducing treatments of hydrotherapy. And he actually recovered quite rapidly from that experience. And he was so impressed by that he began experimenting with all different kinds of hydrotherapy modalities, sweat baths, so that'd be steam, cold baths, wet sheet packs, and a whole variety of different things. You can see a man here who is wrapped up in a wet sheet pack in this particular case as an example of one of his modalities that he worked with that had benefit for various situations. He founded an Austrian Hydrotherapy Institute because he was so impressed with it. He wasn't a medically educated person, became medically educated on his own through the successful use of hydrotherapy and through the institute that he began. In 1835 to 1917, we're going to have some overlapping dates here, but William Winternitz was in Vienna. He was a very famous neurologist, and he used hydrotherapy successfully at the General Vienna Dispensary, which is another name for a hospital at that time. I did some looking around to see if I could find any old pictures of the General Vienna Dispensary, but today dispensaries have a different connotation than they did back in the day. They were not considered a hospital situation. Then they were considered a hospital situation or a place where medicine may have been utilized, but now they tend to be legalized drug dispensary areas. So a different connotation back then than we hear today. In the 1850s, there actually were many water cure institutes that rose up in the United States of America. Another name for hydrotherapy. One of the notable ones was in New Jersey by Dr. Thatcher Trawl. He published a magazine called the Water Cure Journal. And here's a header for that journal, looking at the physiology of hydrotherapy and the laws of life. He was actually an educated layman. Actually, Dr. Thaw educated laymen regarding the simple health measures and the benefits of hydrotherapy treatments for them. So it was a place where he practiced those treatments as well as educated them through a journal so that they could use them at home on their own, because one of the benefits of hydrotherapy is typically the readily available water, cold, and the ability to make it hot for the contrasting hot and cold treatments that are the hallmarks of hydrotherapy. Another one in the 1850s was Dr. James Jackson. He had a Water Cure Institute in Danville, New York, and there were a number of those that popped up through this period of time. He actually went to college at Syracuse Central Medical College in 1850 and purchased the sanitarium here, the Jackson Sanitarium, and converted it into the Sanitarium and Hydrotherapy Institute as an outgrowth. I believe this was the individual who actually had another one in a different location that burned down, and he came looking for an additional or a new place to locate. But he promoted the roles of hydrotherapy through this institute. The building today is unfortunately a derelict building and still stands, but this is what it looked like back in the day when it was at its height. He was actually attributed with saving Clara Barton's life following allowing her to continue to work. So she was considered the angel of the Crimea. She was instrumental in starting the American Red Cross. The Red Cross was already founded in Europe, and she found it there. She began her work here in the United States during the Civil War around 1861 and onward. And she really worked herself bare through all her efforts and through the benefits of hydrotherapy at the Water Cure Institute in Danville, New York, was brought back to full health and able to continue her life-saving work and the establishment of the Red Cross. So there were two actual notable persons from the same town there in Danville. And then in Ellen White, in 1911, always spoke highly of hydrotherapy as being a simple modality that was powerful, encouraged all to use the simple water treatments that had such powerful effects. In Medical Ministry, page 57, she states, "Our people should become intelligent in the treatment of sickness without the aid of poisonous drugs. Many should seek to obtain the education that will enable them to combat disease in its various forms by the most simple methods. Thousands have gone down to the grave because of the use of poisonous drugs who might have been restored to health by simple methods of treatment. Water treatments, wisely and skillfully given, may be the means of saving many lives." So definitely an advocate for using the simple and the God-given things rather than the sorceries of the pharmakia, because those tend to have a taxing, debilitating sense on the system in most cases, because their actions are so powerful in sudden ways, which end up often needing their own set of symptom treatment. Unlike the natural ways, sunshine, pure air, pure water, the natural remedies of diet and nutrition, those are the simple things. And we may be coming to a point here where the general population will not have ready access to the pharmacological suite of treatments that are in common use by people today. And they'll need to resort or return to, if possible, the simple in medicine, the simple treatments. But it does take a self-education or a re-education in order to use those in a way that is beneficial for those around you. So no time to waste in making sure that we have that background available. In 1866, the first Adventist health facility was established. It was known as the Western Health Reform Institute. And you can see it started humbly in a house. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg became the director of that institution at the age of 24. This picture is not a 24-year-old picture, but one in his middle age to later age. But he became a medical doctor and the director at a very young age. He was a very brilliant man. And that kind of ran away with that a little bit and ended up establishing the Battle Creek Medical and Surgical Sanitarium, known as the Battle Creek SAN for short. And it became quite a large facility that he had dreams of it being even bigger. And there was a significant fire that burned it down and took some time to actually attempt to rebuild it. And they did rebuild it, and it worked for many years, even after Kellogg left the sanitarium. But the actual model that was advocated by our health message was having smaller areas like the house you see up at the Western Health Reform Institute. And this is interesting because in that day, Michigan was the West. And now we have the West all the way out to the West Coast, which is the Eastern Pacific. But the idea was to have small home or home-like settings where the hydrotherapy treatments and education would take place, as opposed to massive fund hogging institutions, essentially, that takes lots and lots of staff and overhead to run. And they certainly did a powerful work and a good work, and still do there. In fact, my great uncle was an orderly at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and actually, I think, had interactions with John Harvey Kellogg during his early life. John Harvey Kellogg wrote pretty much the tome or the the foundation document for hydrotherapy, rational hydrotherapy. which is a very thick book, which I'm privileged to have a copy of that with very nice illustrations in it. And it goes through all the different modalities of hydrotherapy implementation. So in 1918, 1919, there was the Spanish flu epidemic that had a death toll of like 25 million people. The Battle Creek Sanitarium was in full swing during that time. And all those people who came to the Battle Creek Sanitarium and were treated using hydrotherapy and judicious nursing all survived the 1918, 1919 flu epidemic. There were no people who didn't. And it's wonderful that this institution of the Seventh-day Adventist Church stood out in that way. And it's an interesting observation to state that there's no health institution that stood out in particular to be a shining beacon of wellness and health during our latest go-round of illnesses. Just individual doctors and treatment protocols that have stood up against what has been purveyed as the way things should be done, because they're seeing positive results as opposed to the negative results of the other modalities of treatment. And hydrotherapy has actually played a positive role this go around too, although it's been less notable because it is less commonly used. It's interesting that in 1920, Simon Baruch, a hydrotherapy pioneer, and he was a pioneer for quite some time, but he was quoted by Cruzen in 1941 in Physical Medicine as saying, of all remedial agents in use since the dawn of medicine, water is the only one that has survived all the vicissitudes of doctrinal changes, because its rise or fall was always contemporaneous with the rise and fall of intelligence among medical men. So as their intelligence increased, I would hope that the use of water therapy would also increase, but it could be the other way around. As they begin to rely more on their own ideas rather than those that are simple and given by God, they may have wandered away, and obviously that's what's happened now, wandered away from the simple in medicine. It's a very, very powerful quote by this hydrotherapy pioneer. So a summary of some of the different effects of the hot and cold treatments. And then next time we'll go into some more of the application of that. So heat as a modality increases blood flow, while cold decreases blood flow. And it does that through vasoconstriction and vasodilation. That's the underlying mechanism of action for each of these observations. So heat, if you think about exercising, your body warms up, you start to become flushed. It's because your skin vasodilates, attempting to throw off the extra heat and sweating. A dog, on the other hand, can't sweat. It just has its tongue hang out farther and farther and farther, because that's the only place where ventilation takes place. Cold, it decreases blood flow. It causes vasoconstriction, drives the blood from the surface tissues into the deeper core tissues, and help to maintain the temperature around the vital organs. The extremities and the surface can be very cold as long as the interior maintains its temperature and doesn't become hypothermic or below body temperature. So heat tends to increase inflammation, and that's fairly obvious if you have an infection or a wound, like a splinter or something. You can actually feel the heat increasing in the area where there's an infection taking place. That's inflammation. And so cold can actually decrease that inflammatory process. And using an alternation of that can be beneficial because it actually increases the blood flow through the area. So it increases the ability of the blood to carry away toxic wastes, which would be underlying byproducts of the infection, bring in nutrients and oxygen that would feed the cells in that area as they're regenerating, and bring nutrition to aid their rebuilding of the tissues. I think last time we talked about the fact that an individual broke a bone, and through use of hot and cold treatments actually stimulated bone deposition and a rapid healing of the fracture that they have. So heat decreases arthritic stiffness, while cold tends to increase arthritic stiffness. Anybody who has arthritis knows that just by default with the temperature outside, when it's warmer, the stiffness is less readily apparent. Of course, you can put a thermophore or other, like a hot water bottle, and that just helps the area be less arthritically stiff. Heat tends to increase edema, while cold decreases edema. So edema essentially is interstitial fluid that builds up between the cells. It's outside the circulatory system, but it has to get back into the circulatory system through the lymphatic system, which is a superimposed circulatory system that moves fluid from the tissues and cells back towards the heart through a system of valves and a squeezing of those vessels by the muscles. So that's why it's important to get exercise, to walk around, to squeeze the muscles of your legs, stand up. Walking is very, very excellent exercise, and that can help push the lymphatic fluids past the valves and work their way back up to the heart and re-enter the circulatory system at that point. So within the lymphatic system, there are lymph nodes which filter the blood as it returns to, and it's not really blood at that point, it's more just interstitial fluid, which basically is fluid between the cells outside the circulatory system. We know that that's how the blood actually gets to the cells, is it leaves the capillaries and squeezes through the endothelial cell tissues and delivers its contents and constituents to the cells around it, and then returns to the capillaries. So there are perforated and fenestrated capillaries where the blood kind of really comes and goes into the capillary action or areas. So heat increases edema because it increases circulation and increases the vasodilation and the permeability of the blood vessels to the blood leaving them, and so it increases the fluid presence in extremities. For example, the legs are a common place for edema to be noticed. Cold decreases edema essentially because it vasoconstricts and sends the blood into deeper tissues and away from the area. So that's the mechanism for decreasing edema. Both heat and cold can decrease muscle spasm pain. So muscle spasms can come from a variety of different sources, back pain or even like a post-exercise strain or sprain can help to mitigate that by increasing the circulation or in the cold case, decreasing and even an alternation of that. So ice and heat both can be beneficial in the pain from muscle spasms. Hemorrhaging, that is bleeding, increases hemorrhaging when you use heat simply because you're vasodilating and you're bringing more blood to the area. So that's going to naturally increase the potential for bleeding. So a cold pack will decrease hemorrhaging. And this is a well-known tool or known thing that is utilized during surgical procedures today. Many times in surgical suites, the temperatures are kept very cool and the person's body is thermally reduced in temperature. That buys them time because it lowers metabolism and they don't have to be as invasive with their life support mechanisms when the body's physiology is slowed down to a slower rate with a cool temperature. That also helps the doctors work more efficiently because they're not overheated to have a nice cool surgical suite. So multiple benefits to that. So again, the primary mechanism of the heat and cold movement around the body is vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which essentially functions as a mechanical pump that's outside of the body's normal scope of operation. So the body's normal pump is the heart. The secondary pump is simply exercise and the movement of muscles. So the squeezing of the muscles, forcing the interstitial fluid back up through the lymphatic system and back towards the heart. So movement, we're designed to move, and the heart facilitates that. And then the movement facilitates the movement of the circulatory system. And then we can do that simply through hydrotherapy, hot and cold treatments, continue to reduce congestion by moving the blood into and out of an area and nourishing and removing toxins at the same time. So next time we'll go into some more of the theory and practice and some of the tools associated with, and we'll begin looking at some of the specific procedures and indications. But you can review this and look at other presentations of a similar nature at preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com.